It is my huge honor to be able to come and host you today. My name is Jeanette Mundra-Gitobu. I am currently the Women in Wind Coordinator and Director of the program here at the Global Wind Energy Council. It is a huge honor on the behalf of our sponsors for today, Curial, the Global Wind Energy Council, and myself to welcome you to today's session around the regions unlocking Africa. Before I begin, I am Kenyan, and there's a couple of habits that we do before a panel session has begun. I fully understand it's in the afternoon, so I'd like to first and foremost teach you a bit of Swahili as we also begin the session itself. So please repeat after me. Hakuna. I can hear you. Hakuna Matata. So as we are saying that, in Swahili, that means no worries. It is a motto that we currently have. And to allow us to begin the session itself, let us repeat once more, Hakuna Matata, but as we shake our hands to get ourselves ready for today's session. Ready? Hakuna Matata. Good, everyone's paying attention. Thank you for humoring me. All right, so can you allow me to give you a brief overview of today's session? Number one, Africa is home to 1.4 billion people, or approximately 16% of the global population. We have 54 countries, and we speak approximately over 1,500 languages. And this year, I am proud to say that Africa in Egypt is home to COP of this year as well, of which GWEC will be a part of, so please come and join our stand there if you will be at COP. But Africa has a lot of potential to be explored, and potential is the question that we are trying to answer in today's session here at the GWEC Global Markets Theater. And in 2021, the Africa region recorded its best year ever for the second year in a row in terms of wind. In total, 14 gigawatts of new capacity is expected to be added in the Africa/Middle East in the next 5 years, which is primarily driven by growth from South Africa, Egypt, and Morocco in Africa, and Saudi Arabia in the Middle East. While wind is expected to play a role in Africa's energy mix in the future, there's still a number of questions that the industry needs to work through. In this session, a panel of experts with an interest in projects in Africa and the Middle East will tackle the big industry questions relating to Africa's power needs and wants, international collaboration, and climate change. So please allow me to introduce our first expert for today, my colleague Feng Zhao, Head of Strategy and Market Intelligence at the Global Wind Energy Council. Feng, the stage is yours.
Sorry, I misunderstood. I thought you are going to invite all the moderate panelists on the board as well before I start. So yeah, today, once again, my colleague already introduced myself. I was on the stage 3 hours ago, moderating the sport market China. I'm a Chinese, but I also play a role at the GWEC. I'm the head of market intelligence, which means that all the report you download free of charge or through the membership, and it's completed by my team. So I've been following the wind industry for nearly, I think, 18 years. So Africa absolutely is one of the regions we follow on a daily basis. Every year, turbine OEM will report the numbers to us. So looking at Africa, I just want to quickly share some numbers, give you guys some general information before the panelists come to the stage, so we can see where we are today and where we're going tomorrow, and what's a challenge, etc. So the next slide, please. Does the mic work? Yes. So to make it easy, I just standing off the floor. So where you can see, that's the first slide. This is also one slide from our Global Wind Report released at the Wind in Europe Bilbao conference. According to GWEC annual report 2022, we record globally 93.6 gigawatt grid connected across the global. You can see 2021 is the second best year ever. But regarding the turbine installation reported by turbine OEM to GWAC, the number actually is more than 100 gigawatt. It's 105 gigawatt. The reason for the difference is because for this statistic, we're talking about installed and grid connected. The turbine OEM report we released is mainly focused on the nacelle installation. Overall, the key message here is clear. We had a fantastic years in the past 2 years. But what's the situation in Africa? Next slide, please. So here we can see, this is just this chart just indicate in terms of the cumulative installation at the end of 2021, we can see where the turbine has been installed. The largest region by the end of 2021 is Asia. We can see nearly 50%, half of the installation from Asia. The key drivers, that's the market, China. We already mentioned earlier today in the panel. China so far is the largest market in terms of new installation and cumulative installation. The second largest region, that's Europe, followed by North America with nearly 18% market share. And then the fourth place, that's Latin America and the Caribbean region, close to 5%. And the number 5 region, that's the Pacific. Key drivers, Australia. Then we have Africa. Africa, sadly, only have 0.9% of the market share. It's below 1%. And where the wind has been installed, and in this region, let's go to the next slide. We have the map for Africa. The map on the right side just indicate where the key market it is in Africa in terms of cumulative installation by the end of last year, where we can see in North Africa, 3.2 gigawatt has been installed by the end of last year, and 99.7% has been equally shared by only 2 markets. That's Egypt and Morocco. And we have a slight installation in Tunisia, but that's below 1 gigawatt. Looking at Sub-Sahara Africa, and we have 4.5 gigawatt installed by the end of last year, and the big contributor, that's South Africa. 70% of the installation in that region. So again, on this map, we can see on the east coast of Africa, we have 2 markets with the light blue. The first one is Kenya. That's where the moderator, my colleague, come from. And the second one, that's Ethiopia. 360 megawatt has been installed by the end of last year, account for 10%. So we can see, look at the regional installation. We have the north, we have the south, we have something on the east, but we have relatively lower installation on the west side. But that's the historic installation. Please go back to the previous slide. Let's see, okay. So what, next previous slide, the second one. Yes, so we are talking about, okay, by the end of last year, Africa only have below than 1% of the global market share. We all know there are a lot of things going on in Africa. How big the potential it is, we can, according to the GWAC Q1 2022 outlook, we believe that Africa in the next 5 years are going to add about 11.5 gigawatt new capacity in the next 5 years between 2022, this year, and 2026. How big is that in terms of the global picture? We're talking about below 1% by the end of last year, but if we're looking at the situation by the end of the next 5 years, they are going to slightly increase the market share to 2%. I think that's a big growth in terms of the size of the market or business opportunity, business status. But is that the real potential Africa has? No. How big it is? Next slide, please. So we can see the first map on the left. That's the wind resource map. We can see so great potential in the north, the average wind speed something between 7.5 to 14.1. Excellent. We have similar excellent wind resources on the west coast as well, and more than 7.5 meters per second. And on the south, relatively light wind, but still in the region, for example, in South Africa, we have actually the average wind speed more than 6.5 meters per second. Based on the World Bank data, in this region, potentially the wind resource beyond maybe 90 meters, the total potential is 59,000 gigawatts. So compared how much we believe they are going to build, 11.5 gigawatts, I think we have great potential available there, waiting to be developed. But why the growth is so slow in Africa so far? We identify the policy instability, and we identify the small domestic market do not support the regional cooperation, and we have the chance on transmission and infrastructure, and also we have the off-take risk in terms also the bankable. It's hard to make the project bankable for this small project across this region. So how we're going to unlock the potential? Next slide. I'm going to just quickly mention a few. I'm pretty sure that our panelists are going to bring more details about this. But from our point of view, based on GWAC market intelligence, we believe that what we need to do before we are ready to unlock the potential in South Africa, that's first, we need firm target commitment. South Africa did already in COP26, but we need more countries to follow. Then capacity building, that's what the GWAC is working on. Number third, that's infrastructure investment. I remember 10 years ago, there's one project built in Ethiopia. It's taken like almost 2 years to build the road and the transmission line, the turbine. After the turbine has been installed, that's nightmare. Number four, we need a strong framework for private money and also the climate funding pledge. At COP26, the developed countries committed 1,000 billion US dollars for this region. But I heard some African countries complain this money is actually not fully achieved so far. So we need the continuously commitment in this region to support the climate funding and to help the growth of renewable. Number six, that's the regional and the technical integration. I mentioned, you can see we have different locations in terms of project installation. In order to bring down the cost of energy, we need the regional cooperation in terms of technology integration. For example, in North Africa, we're talking about wind, solar, the integration across the sea between the Mediterranean country as well. The last part, that's we need the supply chain. Africa has been working hard in the past decade. For example, in South Africa, they have the local content requirement. But due to the relatively unstable pipeline, this doesn't bring the sustainable policy framework to support the continuously establishment of a local supply chain. Right now, we only have some towers, blades produced in Morocco or Egypt. But again, to unlock the potential, I think we need to investment to build the port, build more supply chain for BOP. That's how we can get the job done. This is my last slide. I'm going to stop here and hand over to my colleague, Jenny. And I'm looking forward to see how our panelists are going to share their insight and the wisdom about how we are going to unlock the Africa potential. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Feng. We appreciate the wealth of information that you've been able to provide. Before I invite our esteemed panelists on stage so that I can grill them properly on some of this information, allow me a moment to kindly live cross over to one of our colleagues in South Africa who are currently attending the Africa Renewable Energy Investment Summit. To give a quick background about the summit itself, it is a leading renewable energy investment summit with conference and expo. The event seeks to accelerate renewable energy mix in the African continent by linking institutional investors and project developers, policymakers, energy utilities, regulators, corporates, and the most influential energy sector decision makers under one roof. I would like to please request two of our very amazing esteemed colleagues, Wangari and Juliana. Hello.
Hello, Jeanette. How are you doing?
Thank you. We welcome you both to Wind Energy Hamburg here in Germany. How is South Africa at the moment?
So far, everything is going really well here in Cape Town. We've had a lot of very interesting sessions. Some, in fact, I've just run off the stage from the East Africa investment session to come and give this live crossover to Wind Energy Hamburg. So thank you so much for having me. We're seeing that bringing, investors, bringing DFIs and people to bring money really to the actual projects is important, and to connect developers with the people who have the money is really fruitful. Today we had Empower New Energy and Norfund and Climate Fund managers sign the biggest CNI fund on the continent for $74 million, which is amazing. So that was a great highlight here in Cape Town today. But we're still far from achieving what we need to achieve. Africa needs $35 billion annually for the next 10 years, at least, for the energy transition. And we're only, scratching the surface on that. So we still have a lot of work to do. We're still feeling the pressure here at Africa Renewables Investment Summit in Cape Town, but we're hoping that we will have more and more pledges and more people really looking to put the money where their mouth is. Over to you, Juliana, I think.
Yes, thanks, Wangari, and thanks, Jeanette. So I'm not at ARIS, but given the opportunity, I think the work that GWEC is doing in Cape Town is very important. We do have some representation. I represent the Electricity Sector Association of Kenya. That is a think tank that seeks to enable the sustainable development of electricity in Kenya. And we do have some representation within the panels at ARIS. I think at the very core of this conference is just the fact that it's also leading up to COP27, and and I'm sure Wangari, you probably the discussions that have been had there around the roadmaps of different countries, South Africa, Nigeria, perhaps Kenya as well, and I hope those investment discussions are about putting those dollars to the work that's been done by governments to determine these pathways of both electrification and decarbonization, and looking forward to hearing what will come out of COP because of ARIS.
Thank you so much both for those reflections. I have one more question before Wangari, I let you go, which is, considering that this is Africa's year to host COP, how can we be able to really ensure that the conversations we are currently having can continue even after COP to ensure that Africa has a place on the table in this transition?
From what we're seeing across the continent, there's so many stakeholders that need to be included in this conversation. Jeanette, you and I were in Kigali earlier this year at the SE for All Forum, and we saw how much ministers of energy, the private sector, the public sector, all across the board are so interested in the energy transition. Actually, yesterday in Cape Town, we met the Secretariat of the Just Energy Transition Partnership for South Africa, and even them, South Africa being one of the leaders in this Just Energy Transition package that they signed with various countries in Europe and America. We see that there is a large opportunity to bring people together to keep talking. But it's not only about just the talking. We need to actually do the projects on the ground. Is a lot of the money, there's billions of dollars floating around for projects in Africa. Why are they not getting to the projects? And the same thing that we keep hearing, day in, day out, conference in, conference out, is the developers will say that they don't have money. The financiers will say that they don't have projects. So there's something that we're not doing right to connect the two. And so to be able to really post it on the road to COP and post COP We need to find a way to really connect the billions of dollars that have been set aside for the just energy transition with the actual projects on the ground that are being done by Africans and Europeans and everybody who really need for us to electrify all of Africa. So I think there's still a large space for us to have conferences, but I think me and you sitting down with financiers and with project developers and all our members, behind me here, I think that's where the real key is. And I think from that, if we're able to connect the two in the right way, then we don't have the same complaint that I've just mentioned. I think that's the way forward.
Thank you so much, Wangari, for those reflections. Juliana, same question over to you. What can we be able to do to ensure that as Africa is hosting COP this year, these conversations can continue to be had to ensure Africa has a place in the just transition?
I think there definitely has to be some transparency around. I like that Wangari has identified that there's definitely a gap. I think there needs to be a bit more transparency of what the investors are looking at and also what the developers are struggling with. The other thing is it's important for there to be collaboration across the board. So I can imagine that, and perhaps we'll talk about this a bit more during the panel, there is a little driver at the end of this whole conversation that we rarely talk about, and it's growth. It's about demand. If that demand sparks up, all these issues we are talking about will evaporate, and people will actually identify the problems and they'll come up with a solution. So if we can be a bit more proactive about that, there's a bit more collaboration around figuring out how can we actually grow this and not only look at the generation side, I think that we'll be in a better spot in a few weeks to come.
Thank you so much both for that. I really appreciate the time. I'd like now to cut over to the GWEC Global Markets Theater, where I'd like to invite our esteemed panelists onto the stage tonight. Our first panelist is Paulo Soares, the CEO of Onshore Regional South Europe and Africa, SGRE. Please give him a round of applause. Our second panelist shall be Chris Ford, the COO of Lekela Power. Please also give him a round of applause. And our third panelist joining us online is Juliana Kainga from ISAC, Kenya. Please give her also a round of applause. Good afternoon, both.
Good afternoon.
Can you all hear us?
Good afternoon, everybody.
Yeah, I hope it's working here. Yes.
Perfect. So allow me just to give the context to our audience following up on Fong's presentation where he left off. So he said, how to unlock Africa's wind potential? We need knowledge transfers, we need lobbying training, we need capacity building, infrastructure investment, strong framework for public and private investments, regional and technical integration, and establishment of local supply chain. So that is what he left us off with before he finished his session. Building up on that, I believe the first question will be, how much wind power does Africa need and want? That we can start there as a good opening question. And Chris, I think you can be the first
Sure,
person.
I can start. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chris Ford. I'm from Lekela. We're an African-focused developer and operator, an owner. We have a portfolio of about 1 gigawatt in Africa, built over the last 6 years. About 400 or so turbines in South Africa, Egypt, and Senegal. So we've been there for a while. I've been around Africa for about 16, 17 years, running, dare I say it, gas-to-power projects for a while. I know that shouldn't be used around here, but also more recently, solar and wind. So, I think one thing to say is that there's not just in renewables or wind in Africa, there's always been a push to drive the pace of private sector projects in Africa, and that's probably one of the #1 challenges. And maybe we can explore that a little bit later on. I think you saw from the statistics that there is lots of potential for wind in Africa. I mean, 59,000 gigawatts obviously is a huge number. It won't all materialize in the short term and probably not in the long term either. But the fact of the matter is that African countries are typically seriously underserved by electricity, and for energy more generally. They're both generation capacity short, but also energy short, even within that market. So often, countries have significant parts of their population that don't have access to modern, clean electricity. There's lots of statistics out there, and I think one of the things about Africa is you shouldn't really treat it as a whole. You should be thinking about individual countries because the circumstances differ a lot. But just, to fall foul of that, there's numbers around 60% of the population in Africa not having access to clean energy. So, just starting from there, the potential for any form of generation in Africa is huge. Wind has a significant role to play in that. The resources there are world class. So it's almost a question that doesn't need answering. It's not how much can it take. It's just, we can build, if we can build these projects, they can be used and they're useful.
Thank you so much for that question and your response. I'd like to move over to you, Paulo. Same question. How much wind power does Africa need and want?
Okay, so good afternoon to all of you. My name is Paulo Soares. I'm Brazilian, and I'm working with wind everywhere you can imagine. I lived in China for 10 years, worked for Indian companies, built wind farms pretty much everywhere. And I hope that what I have learned can also be a contribution to what we are discussing here. I think Africa needs how much we can build, as much as we can build. But I think the problem is that we need to break a little bit this access we have. Statistics can be a little bit difficult, right? You have 7 gigawatts, but then almost everything is built in 2 countries, so in 3 countries. It's Morocco, Egypt, and South Africa. First thing you have to do is to break that access and try to give access to other countries. So Siemens Gamesa, we are building projects in Djibouti. It's not even in the map. We are building projects in Mauritania, also not in the map. We are building 100 megawatts in Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, total installation is 300 megawatts. So it's going to build another 100. But in order for this to actually become more achievable, I think we have a lot of the tools. We have the financial instruments, we have the money, we have the project, but what we don't have is how we actually share the infrastructure risk. Right, so I can give you a clear example. As we are building a wind farm in Ethiopia, only port of entry is Djibouti. And then we needed to transport the turbines through Djibouti into Ethiopia. And during the rainy season, 70 kilometers of road disappeared. And the turbines are stuck in Djibouti harbor. How we share those things? And the wind farm that we're building in Djibouti is 50 megawatts, not much, but it's gonna double the renewable energy capacity generation of Djibouti. So of course, there will be challenges. There will be challenges related not only to transport the turbines, but related to roads, cranes, qualified personnel, people who are doing the electrical commissioning of those turbines. We need to bring people mostly from other countries. The execution risk and how we share this and how we analyze this and how we can put all the stakeholders around that table to actually discuss it, share it, so that not only one side is paying for it. That is, to me, in my view, key. If I would have a project today to be built in Ethiopia or Djibouti or Mauritania, I have a lot of other opportunities in, say, Mali and Tanzania and Kenya. To get approval to build those projects under the current circumstances is extremely impossible, extremely difficult to impossible, because the risks are so high. So I think we needed to work together to, on top of the money, on top of the wind resources, is to actually build a mechanism that allows those projects to be de-risked, not on the financial side, on the execution side. To me, that's key.
Thank you so much for those reflections. Juliana, allow me to cut over to you now on the same exact question. How much wind power does Africa need and want?
I think I'll answer that question by also posing another one, and it's more, so how much development is dependent on energy on the continent? And we're seeing that there's going to be a lot of electrification and decarbonization efforts, even on the continent, as we're also seeing it globally. So just to give you some numbers on average, and I like that Paulo has mentioned that we kind of need to separate the guys with huge capacity. So South Africa, Morocco, and the guys in North Africa. If you look at just the middle, excluding those countries, we have an average electricity consumption rate of 180 kilowatt hours per capita. When we have other countries that are very well developed that are hitting around 4,000, 5,000. And that's essentially what we want to be as Africans and as a continent, well developed and resilient. So if wind energy can actually take up that gap, then that's how much we need. But then again, it needs to be something that can compete with its alternatives and fully replace, if I could say that. I don't want to start a huge debate on whether wind can fully take on 100%, but can it compete with its alternatives to help industrialize and develop? So I think that's where most, to your question, how much do we need and how much do we want? And then just to something that has been mentioned right now, there is the opportunity to actually build out infrastructure, grid infrastructure, and interconnect power pools. So the struggles that we are having and the risks that we are seeing in setting up in each and every single country where we see there's a resource, perhaps we need to look at it a bit differently and say, it's less risky here, and we've done it before. And if we build out the grid infrastructure, then this power can go out to a lot more of the population crossing borders, and can basically, for example, connect the East African power pool to the South African power pool. That could mean that we could actually have a lot more wind in the system on the continent.
Thank you so much for those reflections, Juliana. And I think I'll come back to you first for my next question. I know you had mentioned about it's important sometimes to separate the northern powers in terms of like the wind sector itself to the southern counterparts. But my next question will be, how can international partners play a part in ensuring that Africa is able to meet its energy needs?
I think I can answer this in the context of the conversation that we're having now and the conversation that we're going to have in November. So we have a great arena, that's the COP27, and we have a lot of very influential and a lot of decision makers that are going to be there. That there needs to be, certain conversations need to be had. But it can't be the same kind of conversations. I think international players and people who have interest to actually invest and set up shop and grow within the continent in the renewable energy context need to come up with a different way to sell the renewable energy story, having a bit more of a compelling story around it. So we need to plug into the conversations that are happening in each country of interest. So Nigeria has set up their roadmap to 2060. They've already highlighted what they want to do. There are conversations that are happening in South Africa when it comes to green hydrogen and greening their industries and manufacturing. There are conversations that have happened in Kenya about what does it look like for the next 20 years for us if we're going to use the already decarbonized electricity grid that we have. So we have to customize. I think international players have to really do their homework and customize the conversations that they're going to have. Just the story of renewable energy and wind is green, it's clean, it's fun and fantastic, let's do it, will not cut it this year. There's a lot that countries that are dealing with, and we have to make sure that we are alive to those conversations and we are alive to the struggles, and we have to show that renewable energy is actually going to be part of the solution.
Thank you so much for those reflections, Juliana. Paulo, allow me to come to you with the same exact question. I mean, SGRE is a global player or a global player itself. So how can international players and partners play a part in this African story?
Well, I think in general, everything that we need is already there. Resources is there, willingness to build is there, the discussions about the policies, supporting schemes and things like this is all there. I think what we need is really, as I mentioned before, decouple a little bit these three very big markets and actually emphasize the build-up into the other markets. Because what the fundamentals are in place. Now, of course, if you then incentivize companies to go in there, because the base it's prepared. And by this, I come back again to the infrastructure. You cannot do anything if there are no roads, no grids, no cranes, no not a supporting system around that allow that build up to happen. Wind is very quick. We can build wind farms rather fast. You can build up capacity in a speed that no any other source can do. But then at the end of the day, we have also to put ourselves on the place of that population. Me being Brazilian, I know a little bit about this. People actually should not care about what it is that you are building. They only care about having access to electricity. Whether that is brown, black, green, blue, if we are them, we have to put ourselves in their position. And to create a solution that they are a part of it, either by training, by servicing the wind farms, by having a long-term contract, employment security, that is brought by this infrastructure that's being built in renewables, and do this together with the governments. I think without this is almost impossible. We needed to have this base first in order to unlock this capacity that we have there, because everything else is ready.
Thank you for that. So everything else is ready. And now, Chris, allow me to come to you now, because Lekela Power is, I believe, having one of their offices in Egypt as well, where COP is being hosted. So from your perspective, how can international partners and players play a part?
Yeah, I think it's an important question, and I will come to it. I think first and foremost to say that Africa has to take the lead, right? It has to be for African governments to take the lead on setting their plans out and reaching for renewables. And I think what we've seen over the last 5, maybe even more recent, the last 3 years, is governments putting out their plans, clearly setting out their intentions to build renewable projects. And that's not just a green agenda, that's also an economic rationale. And I think that's, that is now won that battle. We are in the stage now where if you go to a government, you can tell them, I'm going to build you a wind farm, and it will save you money from importing liquid fuels internationally. It will save your foreign currency. And so that, that is an attractive proposition when you're going to make that to Africa. One of the challenges, and as a developer, we've closed 7 projects in there, so we understand what it takes to be bankable. One of the big challenges for Africa, actually, in addition to what Paolo is saying in terms of logistics and support frameworks that are missing there, is the capacity of those markets to pay for those ongoing long-term contracts that are needed to secure those investments. So what I mean there is often, for ourselves, our typical customer is either a government or a state utility, and those state utilities really do not have balance sheets of any notes. They're often underfunded, or their tariffs are artificially subsidized, so they're not making any money. So therefore, as a developer, when I'm investing my money and thinking, okay, I've got to get that paid back over 20 years, I need some form of credit enhancement. And I think, so that kind of comes to your question of, what is the things that international partners can help with? And there's lots, we could go on forever, and I know we don't really have time, but I think for me, number one is using some of this climate funding to help provide those guarantees to governments and secure funding from the private sector to build those projects. There's plenty of DFIs, there's plenty of debt financing available out there, but actually, really to sort of make a difference and ramp up more rapidly, we have to solve this credit situation with off-takers and with governments, and that's the number one thing I think that climate funding can do and international partners can focus on.
Well, thank you for that. And I'd like to continue on this conversation line of utility scale generation itself. Because my next question would be specifically, is there a need for utility scale generation? And if there is, what's the difference between this scale and off-grid or small-scale wind power?
Yeah, I mean, we do utility scale only as a company. We typically project finance or non-recourse finance our projects. And that means just by the nature of the development process, you need to have scale to justify putting that effort into. Mini grids are sort of, often seen as a first step to electrify a region or something. It is very difficult to do that at scale, and there's a number of companies who have been specialising that and trialling, but it's difficult to grow to a material-sized business in that process because it's slow. There's lots of problems to solve around there, collecting tariffs and things like that. But so we see the growth in renewable capacity, but also all capacity in Africa to still come from the utility scale sector. I think just by the nature of projects, just by the difficulties in development, development timescales for a wind farm in Africa are typically 5 to 7 years. Something we have to try to shrink and, on developers to try to improve that. But, to carry those development costs for such a long period of time, you need a project of scale. And so that's why utility scales will always be there.
Thank you for that. And Paulo, also to you the same question. Is there a need for utility scale generation? And if so, how does this compare to, let's say, off-grid or small-scale wind power?
I first of all completely agree with Chris. Actually, we work together quite a lot.
Yeah.
So just to let this out, and I completely agree. I think wind power as it is today is not really the most attractive for off-grid or non-utility scale kind of business. I think perhaps we have better solutions with PV or other things that could do better. Just for us, if we have a small wind farm, small by this I mean say 50 megawatt, we're talking today typically 10 turbines, and then you have the infrastructure for maintaining those wind turbines in an isolated place. It's really difficult. And then you're talking about Africa, everything is big, everything is far away. So, and I can give you a quick, we have a lot of wind farms in Morocco. We would like to build one in Mauritania. We also build one in Mauritania. Then we have another one that is at the southern border of Mauritania, ours in the northern border. That is impossible. There is no benefit of having that wind farm in Mauritania in the northern part to help to optimize things in somewhere else because everything is so far away. So utility size, utility scale is absolutely, in my view, a must because otherwise there will be so many other complications that will make wind in general too expensive to be affordable. And that makes things rather difficult, in my view.
Thank you so much for those reflections. And Juliana, I'd like to cut over to you as well and ask the same question because of the work you do at ESAC based in Kenya. Is there a need for utility scale generation? And how does this compare with, let's say, off-grid or small-scale wind power?
Yes, thanks. I completely agree with Paulo and Chris on the economies of scale when it comes to especially wind. It's very different from, let's say, solar, where you can actually find small distributed energy systems that would serve certain remote communities. So there is a place for utility scale generation and wind. I think it's difficult to industrialize a country without that sort of centralized and then basically interconnectedness through the grid infrastructure. It's very difficult to do that in pockets of distributed energy systems. However, we are seeing utility scale of grid in certain countries where distributed energy thresholds have been increased, like in South Africa, where we're seeing a lot of mining companies and a lot of industries actually taking on huge capacities that's of 100 megawatts to almost 150 megawatts that's going to be solely for their captive use. So we're also seeing that happening. A lot of that is solar, but some of that is also wind. So I feel like there'll always be a place for utility scale for as long as we're talking about industrialization and we're talking about economies of scale. There is still a place for distributed energy systems, more so for solar, where it's a bit more difficult for wind, as Paulo has mentioned.
Thank you so much. And as a heads up to everyone, we're about to close our session, but I do have one last question for our esteemed panelists, which is, what role will climate change play in terms of driving wind power's growth in Africa? And what is EU's investment being channeled into? How is EU investments being channeled into African projects?
That's a big question for a short period of time, I think. I think the first one is probably easy to answer. I think first and foremost, climate change is giving a focus on renewable technologies in Africa. I think we should be clear. Africa has not been any way remotely responsible for climate change. You know, the carbon intensity of the economies in Africa is extremely low. So, you know, we're not looking to Africa to resolve this problem. I think what we are seeing, though, is that because there is an increased focus on renewables, African governments are now focused on these technologies, and that they're seen as the sort of next steps they want to take in the build out of their systems. As I said earlier on, I think, you know, probably, you know, without going on too long, one of the things that we've noticed as a developer over the last decade or last 5 years or so is that, of course, the discussion is about climate and green technologies, but actually more so about the economics of power. You know, it's really important that these countries secure cheap, low-cost, clean, modern energy. And now, you know, you go to a government and offer them a tariff for a wind farm that'll outstrip any thermal power plant out there. So that's actually, climate is important, but actually the economics are actually driving this forward in Africa.
Thank you for that. And Paulo, I'd like to go to you with the same question.
Yeah, I think as Chris has already said, Africa is the continent that impacted the least climate change. However, is the one that is most impacted by it. I think this we also have to see. And coming back to what I have mentioned a little bit, I think for the people in Africa who are actually in real need of access to electricity, whatever it is that you put it in there, that enable these people to actually have access to the comforts that we already have. That is, to me, key. It so happens that actually renewable is the quickest, cheapest, fastest, best way. Right? When I talk about the roads of infrastructure or grid or whatever, you just think about it. Hydropower plants, I work with hydropower plants for 20 years of my life. Hydropower plants, gas-fired power plants or whatever, they need the same infrastructure. They also need grid. However, the infrastructure around dams and all the things that are required to this kind of stuff is actually way more expensive, take a lot longer to build than roads, than having the infrastructure to build wind farms. So wind farms, solar farms, this is the way to go, simply because it's the cheapest and fastest. And Africa has plenty of resources. So if we use this opportunity to use this kind of resource to provide something that is badly needed and actually at the lowest cost, that is already proven, we, as I have mentioned before, we already have it all. And this must be our way. Is it because this is the best solution we have available at the moment?
Thank you for those reflections. And Juliana, I would like to close with you with the same exact question. How is climate change playing a role in driving wind power growth in Africa, and how is EU investment being channeled into African energy projects?
Yeah, thanks, Jeanette. So I think it's very clear from the comments that have been made that in the African context, it's really not about climate mitigation. It's about climate adaptation. And we're not talking about, you know, dealing with drought and dealing with floods. We're talking about renewable energy being a driver or a tool to manage climate adaptation. Then it's about renewable energy helping countries get to economic prosperity so that they're resilient and they're prepared. So I think I'd mentioned this before, but one thing that is usually not on the laundry list of challenges is actually the demand side of this whole value chain of electricity. I know we're talking about generation, but if we start a generation conversation in a place like Kenya, it's going to be dead on arrival. So how do we link that renewable energy generation conversation to demand and industrialization and economic prosperity? How can we attract investment on already decarbonized electricity grid? There are a lot of companies that are looking for spaces where they're able to decarbonize their operations, selling this story of a decarbonized grid, for example, like in Kenya or Ethiopia, where investors can come in and actually set up and industrialize. I think that's probably one way that we can ensure that there's a lot more money coming into the country. We're getting rid of the unemployment issues. We are reducing the cost of living, and we're basically ensuring that the country is able to be prepared and a bit more resilient from a climate adaptation standpoint. And I think renewable energy can do that, and wind can do that as well. So we're talking about things like green hydrogen, bringing data centers to this electricity grid, and also huge manufacturers like steel. If these demand sectors can actually be tied into the generation side of things, I think then renewable energy and the wind conversation would make sense in a lot of these countries.
Well, everyone, thank you so much for your time. We have had Juliana, we have had Paulo, we had Chris on board. We also had Fang. We really appreciate each and every one of you for joining us in this session. Please, let's close the round of applause for all of our panelists, and I wish you a happy afternoon.